To understand the sheer, paralyzing horror that gripped Japanese tank crews upon their first full encounter with the American Sherman, one must first grasp the context of their early, astonishing success. The Japanese Empire entered the Second World War not with technological parity, but with profound confidence in the suitability of their armored fleet, specifically the Type 97 Kaiha medium tank. This confidence was not born of delusion. It was rooted in the crushing victories achieved across the Asian mainland and the early phases of the Pacific Campaign. The Chi-Ha, a squat, relatively light tank equipped with a low-velocity 57mm main gun, later upgraded in some variants to a higher-velocity 47mm, was perfectly optimized for the conditions it initially faced. It possessed excellent mechanical reliability, a low ground pressure ideal for navigating the soft, muddy terrain of the jungle, and a decent turn of speed. Against the disorganized Chinese resistance or the scattered, technologically outdated armored units of the British in Malaya and Singapore, the Chi-Ha was a powerful, successful weapon, a symbol of Japanese mechanized superiority. Commanders hailed it as the pinnacle of the nation's armored effort, a machine tailored for the rapid, decisive strikes of the blitzkrieg-style warfare Japan had perfected. This early success bred a dangerous complacency, a myth of the jungle tank that masked a fundamental truth. Japan's geographical isolation and unique strategic focus meant its engineers never had to compete with the rapid, devastating armored escalation unfolding in Europe. The Japanese Tank Corps was simply not forced to develop the heavier armor, the powerful high-velocity anti-tank cannons, or the resilient industrial base necessary to compete with the true medium tank designs of the West. Their tanks were built to defeat infantry and light armor. They were not designed for tank-on-tank slugfests. By the time the American industrial Leviathan finally landed on Guadalcanal and the subsequent islands, Japanese doctrine and armor design had stagnated for nearly a decade, built on the fatal assumption that their current armor was sufficient. This mythical confidence was the tragic setup for the technological annihilation that was soon to follow, a shock that would turn the aggressive Japanese tank commander into a desperate, cowering victim. The counterpoint to the nimble, jungle-optimized Chi-Ha was the weapon that would define American ground dominance, the M4 Sherman medium tank. When the Sherman began arriving in force on the beaches of the Pacific Islands, it was the physical embodiment of an industrial civilization at full throttle, a massive, standardized war machine designed for resilience and survivability. While the Japanese had optimized for speed and maneuver, the Americans optimized for defense and mass production. The M4 was significantly larger, heavier, and possessed a decisive advantage in its core engineering. Crucially, the Sherman's design incorporated sloped armor, a feature the Japanese tanks entirely lacked. This was not just about the thickness of the steel, but the geometry of its placement. A projectile striking an angled plate must travel through far more steel, the effective thickness, than a projectile hitting a flat, vertical surface. And sloped armor has a high probability of causing a round to ricochet entirely. This design innovation turned the M4's hull into a terrifying, moving fortress, capable of deflecting rounds that should, by all logic, have penetrated it. Beyond its formidable protection, the Sherman was technologically superior in every measurable metric. It featured a powerful, reliable engine, a three-man turret with powered traverse, allowing the gunner to swing the main 75mm cannon onto target quickly and efficiently, and an integrated system of communications that gave the crew cohesion and battlefield awareness. The Japanese crews, often relying on flag signals and shouting, could only dream of. The Sherman was the product of a limitless industrial base, a machine that could be lost and replaced instantly by another, manufactured by the thousands. Its presence on the battlefield was not merely a tactical threat. It was the arrival of the steel wall, a psychological statement from a nation that viewed war as a problem of logistical and overwhelming material force. A reality that the Japanese tank crews, whose entire world was based on material scarcity and spiritual fervor, were about to confront with devastating, fatal results. The moment of truth arrived not with a roar, but with a sharp, sickening metallic crack that defined the technological gulf separating two empires. The Japanese tank crews, maneuvering their nimble Type 97 Shinhodo Chiha tanks, spotted their armored target, the imposing high-profile American M4 Sherman. Based on their established doctrine and the success of their upgraded 47mm main gun against earlier, lighter American armored vehicles, the Japanese crews closed with a measure of aggressive confidence. They had been trained to prioritize the flanks or the rear, but in the chaos of the jungle terrain, a frontal engagement was sometimes unavoidable, and they expected their high-velocity 47mm shell to punch through the Sherman's frontal plate at a reasonable combat distance. The Japanese tank commander would have barked the range and elevation, the gunner lining up the sight, likely aiming for the center of the hull, perhaps hoping to disable the transmission or set the fuel tank alight. The gun fired, and the shell sped towards the American behemoth. But when the round impacted the Sherman's heavily sloped glacis plate, there was no sound of a clean penetration, no tearing metal, no explosive plume of smoke erupting from the interior. Instead, there was a terrible, sharp sound that was alien to their experience, a metallic thwang followed by a high-pitched ricochet. The shell, the best their military industry could provide, had simply glanced off the Sherman's armor, deflecting harmlessly into the sky, sometimes visible as a brightly spinning piece of useless metal. The horror was instantaneous and absolute. In the enclosed, echoing confines of the turret, the Japanese crew would have momentarily frozen, the commander staring through his narrow slit, frantically trying to find the telltale damage that wasn't there. Their best shot, delivered with doctrinal precision, had failed to even scratch the paint. Their tank, a machine they had trusted with their lives and the honor of their nation, was revealed, in that instant, to be nothing more than a slow, lightly armored coffin, completely incapable of defeating its primary opponent. This was the first horror, a brutal, clinical demonstration that the technological premises of their armored force were fundamentally obsolete, and that every future tank engagement would be a suicide mission. The failure of the initial round was often followed by a panicked, frantic attempt to reload and fire again, a desperate test of the impossible that only served to magnify the terror. Japanese gunners, their hands slick with sweat, would slam another 47mm shell into the breach and fire, aiming for seemingly weaker points, the driver's port, the seam where the hull met the turret, or the gun mantle. But each shot was greeted by the same devastating, chilling result, the sharp, demoralizing sound of the bounce. This recurring, high-pitched metallic clang became the sonic signature of the Japanese Army's technological inferiority, signaling a profound psychological breakdown in the tank crew. They were staring at a target they could not harm, while knowing that the Sherman, which had barely registered their attack, was now lining up its massive 75mm gun to respond. The technical reality behind this terror was the genius of the Sherman's design, paired with the limitations of the Japanese projectile. The Japanese 47mm high-explosive anti-tank or armor-piercing AP rounds lacked the sheer kinetic energy and structural integrity required to defeat the M4's sloped, heat-treated steel. The 56 degrees of slope on the Sherman's glacis plate presented an effective armor thickness far greater than the 47mm gun could achieve, causing the relatively lightweight projectile to shatter, disintegrate, or simply deflect harmlessly away. Furthermore, the Japanese were frequently battling issues with inferior shell quality and propellant charges, compounding the fundamental deficit in velocity and mass. This continuous, impossible sight, their best ammunition bouncing off the enemy's forehead, did more than just fail to destroy the tank. it destroyed the will of the tank crew. It was a visible, audible demonstration that their sacrifices and courage were rendered meaningless by the superior industrial power of their adversary. Facing this impenetrable steel wall, the tank crews were forced to abandon all conventional armored doctrine and consider the only remaining option: suicidal, close-quarters combat. Faced with the impenetrable armor of the Sherman and the futility of their standard anti-tank weapons, Japanese tank crews and supporting infantry were driven to adopt increasingly desperate, often suicidal, tactics. Conventional armored warfare, based on maneuver and frontal engagements, was rendered obsolete. In its place arose a grim calculus of self-sacrifice. When their 47mm shells failed to penetrate, the only remaining option for the Japanese was to eliminate the Sherman at point-blank range, often requiring a direct physical assault on the moving behemoth. This led to the widespread implementation of suicide tactics. Infantrymen, often carrying magnetic anti-tank mines like the Type 99 magnetic mine, or satchel charges filled with high explosives, would have to crawl or run directly onto the tank's hull, risking instant death from machine gun fire, concussive blasts from the main gun, or being crushed under the treads. Once in position, they would attempt to attach the Sintra's magnetic mine to a vulnerable spot, often the engine deck, the rear of the turret, or the side armor, and then activate it, sacrificing themselves in the process. Another horrific tactic involved a Japanese soldier literally placing an anti-tank mine on the end of a long pole and running it under the tank's tracks or belly, detonating it manually. Tank crews, witnessing the futility of their own main armament, would occasionally resort to ramming Shermans in a desperate, last-ditch effort, hoping to damage its tracks or guns, or even attempting to drop live grenades onto the Sherman's engine deck through its open hatches. This wasn't strategy. It was the ultimate expression of desperation, a testament to the fact that the Japanese had no technological counter to the Sherman. These acts of individual bravery and mass sacrifice, while occasionally successful in disabling a Sherman, came at an astronomical human cost, painting a stark picture of the technological and tactical cul-de-sac the Japanese ground forces found themselves trapped within. While Japanese tank crews struggled to even scratch the paint of an M4 Sherman, the American tank possessed a devastating offensive capability that made every engagement a one-sided slaughter. This was the Sherman's firepower, primarily centered around its highly effective 75mm M3 main gun, and later, the more potent 76mm. This weapon was a versatile and lethal instrument of destruction, capable of firing multiple types of ammunition. Its standard M61 armor-piercing capped APC round, with its higher muzzle velocity and heavier projectile, could easily penetrate the thinner, unsloped armor of the Japanese Type 97 Chiha and Type 95 Hago tanks from significant combat distances. Against the Japanese armor, a direct hit from a 75mm shell was almost always fatal, leading to catastrophic internal damage, rapid crew incapacitation, and often the immediate combustion of the Prus, tank's fuel or ammunition. Beyond its anti-tank capabilities, the Sherman's 75mm gun also excelled in firing high-explosive HE shells, which were devastating against Japanese infantry, fortified bunkers, and light field positions. In the dense jungle and cave systems of the Pacific, where Japanese forces often dug in deeply, the ability to deliver powerful, explosive ordnance with pinpoint accuracy was invaluable. Supplementing this main gun were multiple 30-caliber machine guns, coaxial and bow-mounted, and a 50-caliber heavy machine gun mounted on the turret, providing unparalleled anti-personnel and anti-aircraft capabilities. These machine guns could shred light Japanese vehicles, suppress infantry assaults, and tear through unarmored positions, creating a continuous wall of lead that completely overwhelmed any Japanese counterattack. The combination of impenetrable defense and devastating offense made the Sherman a true king of the battlefield in the Pacific, transforming every tank engagement into a brutal, unequal contest where the Japanese were outmatched in every single aspect of destructive capability. The horrifying reports filtering back from the Pacific battlefields, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and the initial assaults in the Philippines did not just detail high casualty rates. They painted an unambiguous picture of catastrophic technological failure. Back in Tokyo, this reality plunged the Army's high command and its Armored Engineering Corps into the engineers' despair. It was a crisis of industrial and material faith. The failure of the 47mm gun to defeat the M4 Sherman's sloped armor could not be dismissed as isolated incidents. They represented an irreversible flaw in the Empire's entire armored philosophy, one rooted in years of strategic miscalculation. Japanese engineers, though highly capable, were confronted with an insurmountable logistical and material gulf. Unlike the German effort, which could pivot to the heavier Panther and Tiger tanks, Japan lacked the colossal industrial base required for high-volume production of the requisite heavy, high-quality rolled steel, and the massive, powerful liquid-cooled engines necessary to reliably field a tank comparable to the Sherman. Their foundries and factories were already stretched to the breaking point, constantly battling resource shortages and prioritizing the Imperial Navy and the critical air war effort. Any attempt to design and produce a true Sherman killer was immediately starved of resources. Engineers were forced into the doomed effort of designing tanks like the Type 4 Shaitu, which mounted a competitive 75mm gun, but these projects were delayed by years, plagued by material reallocations, and ultimately failed to reach mass production. The logistical reality was inescapable. The American submarine blockade choked off vital raw material imports, and strategic bombing crippled their manufacturing centers. This strategic failure meant that the Japanese forces were effectively locked into fighting a 1,944-tank war with 1,937 technology. The engineers' internal reports were bleak, confirming that nothing short of a total, years-long overhaul of the national steel production and engine manufacturing base could field a counterweapon in time. The greatest tragedy lay in the ethical dilemma. The technicians knew, with cold certainty, that their soldiers and the remaining Kiha tanks were being sent on missions where their primary weapons were useless against the enemy's armored fist. This industrial and strategic surrender sealed the fate of the Japanese ground forces long before the final shots were fired. The technological despair of the engineers quickly translated into a strategic nightmare on the front lines, defining battles along the bloody road to Manila and across the most fortified islands of the Pacific. The Sherman became the central pillar of the American advance, utilized as a versatile breakthrough weapon against the static, deep-layered Japanese defenses. In major campaigns, like the recapture of the Philippines and the brutal fights for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the M4's near invulnerability to the standard Japanese anti-tank weapons forced the defenders into tactics that multiplied their casualties exponentially. Since Japanese tank forces were quickly decimated in head-to-head encounters, the burden of stopping the Shermans fell entirely onto the infantry and fixed anti-tank artillery. This mandated the widespread use of terrifying suicide tactics, soldiers waiting in foxholes to rush magnetic mines onto the hull, or the use of heavy artillery pieces employed in desperate, point-blank ambush rolls, often sacrificing the gun and crew for a single shot. The Sherman, however, was designed to defeat these very threats. Its high volume of coaxial and turret-mounted machine gun fire suppressed infantry assaults with ease, while its powerful 75mm high-explosive rounds rapidly pulverized Japanese bunkers and positions with impunity. Furthermore, the sheer, crushing mass of the Sherman allowed it to function as a devastating bulldozer, literally burying entrenched troops and crushing concrete pillboxes that had resisted heavy artillery bombardment for days. The sight of these impervious, unstoppable American tanks rolling relentlessly forward shattered the morale of the Japanese defenders. It was a visible, tangible representation of the overwhelming material superiority of the United States, confirming the futility of resistance. The final, desperate tank battles in the streets of Manila in 1945, where General Yamashita deployed nearly all his remaining armor, were catastrophic. Japanese crews, forced into close quarters, aimed for the Sherman's weakest points only to be immediately countered by superior American optics and the devastating 75mm fire. The resulting wrecks of Japanese armor littered the streets, serving as grim, smoking monuments to the technological failure of their command. The consistent, decisive battlefield dominance of the Sherman ensured that the American advance, though bloody, was inexorable, turning every major engagement into a systematic, industrial dismantling of the Japanese ground defense structure. The story of the Sherman tank against the Japanese armored corps is not merely a tale of a technical mismatch. It is a profound historical illustration of industrial asymmetry, the tragic point where valor, tenacity, and fighting spirit collide with the overwhelming force of mass-produced technological superiority. The M4 Sherman, with its thick, sloped armor and devastating 75mm gun, became the ultimate, uncompromising symbol of American industrial might, a relentless force that rendered the Japanese war effort on the ground fundamentally and tragically obsolete. Every single metallic bounce of a Japanese 47mm shell off the Sherman's glacis plate was a painful, audible confirmation to the crews of the Type 97 Chi-Ha that their sacrifice, while honorable by doctrine, was strategically meaningless. The psychological impact of realizing their most potent armored weapon could not scratch the enemy's forehead was arguably as destructive as any shell, leading directly to the desperate, costly shift towards suicidal, close-quarters tactics that merely prolonged the inevitable and multiplied Japanese casualties exponentially. The failure was sealed in the Japanese High Command's decision to starve their army of the necessary resources, prioritizing naval supremacy in the desperate hope of a decisive sea battle that never materialized. This strategic misallocation condemned their ground forces to fight a modern war with outdated tools. The legacy of this technological disparity is vast. The Sherman guaranteed the American advance across the Pacific, serving as the necessary, mobile fortress that could defeat the deep, elaborate fortifications on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Without the Sherman's invulnerability to the Japanese primary anti-tank assets, the casualty rates for American infantry would have been astronomical, and the timeline for defeating the entrenched enemy exponentially longer. The Sherman's dominance ensured the war was an unwinnable fight for the Japanese army, demonstrating that the future of warfare belonged unequivocally to the nation capable of fielding superior technology in overwhelming numbers. The end of the Pacific War marked the final, definitive end of the light to medium tank era for major powers and solidified the doctrine that armor, firepower, and crew protection must always be prioritized. A grim lesson learned in blood by the horrified crews who watched their shells bounce off the advancing American steel.